The 14th summit of BRICS countries in Beijing, virtually, that is. It is meant to produce a layout for a new era of global development, as the hosts put it. But it will also focus on other items, Russia's war in Ukraine, for example, and the ongoing pandemic. Now, BRICS is an acronym for the 5 major emerging global economies, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 countries are home.
Like Saudi Arabia. First, it refused to ramp up oil production for the European Union. And now, it wants to be a part of BRICS, a bloc of 5 major emerging economies, including China and Russia. The president of South Africa says Riyadh is interested in joining this bloc.
Hello everyone. As we all know, the dollar is the most powerful currency in the world. If you have watched our Why is Indian Rupee Falling video, then you know that how the dollar became the most important currency for world trade. If you have not watched that video yet, then I would personally suggest you to go and watch that video also for a better understanding. The link is given in the description. So, before moving on to the topic, we have to understand that how the dollar became the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve Bank to respond to the unreliability and instability of a currency system that was previously based on banknotes issued by the individual banks. This was the same time that the US economy became the world's largest, surpassing that of the United Kingdom. World commerce still centered around the UK, as the majority of transactions took place in British pounds. So, if you don't know what is Federal Reserve Bank, then it is the Central Bank of US. Simply saying that it is like Reserve Bank of India, which controls the monetary policies. The majority of developed countries pegged their currencies to gold as a way to stabilize currency exchanges. But when World War I broke out in 1914, many countries suspended the use of gold and started to pay their military expenses with paper money, which devalued their own currencies. As it did in World War I, the US entered World War II. The United States served as the main supplier of weapons and other goods. Most countries paid in gold, and making the US the owner of the majority of the world's gold by the end of the war. This made a return to the gold standard impossible by the countries that depleted their reserves. Delegated from 44 allied countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In 1944, they came up with a system to manage the foreign exchange that would not disadvantage any country. The delegation decided that the world's currencies would no longer be linked to gold but could be pegged to the US. The arrangement came to be known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. It established the authority of central banks, which would maintain fixed exchange rates between their currencies and the dollar. In turn, the United States would redeem US dollars for gold on demand. Countries had some degree of control over currencies in situations wherein the values of their own currencies became too weak or too strong relative to the dollar. They could buy or sell their currency to regulate the money supply. Now you know how the dollar became the world's reserve currency, and after that the US is the key to control the world trade. But the question over here is, can we make a new currency which will help us in international trade? So the answer is BRICS. Now let's understand what is BRICS. BRICS is the union of 5 countries that are Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. These countries came together to form a new currency which will help them to trade between themselves. And it is a headache for US because these 5 countries contributes 41% of the world's population and a combined GDP of $24.4 trillion. The most important factor is that these 5 countries are developing countries and they have a combined foreign reserves of $4.46 trillion. Along with these 5 countries, now Saudi Arabia wants to enter in this group. However, the question is why Saudi Arabia wants to join this group. So, the answer lies in the petrodollar agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia. It was the meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and Saudi Arabia's king. This was the deal that Saudi Arabia would sell the oils in the dollars, and in return, the US would provide security to Saudi Arabia. So, when Joe Biden threatened to pass the bill to stop weapons trade, Saudi Arabia said, if you threaten us with the weakening of our security, then we are going to mess with your dollar by cutting down the production of oils. And more importantly, if you look at the past 3 years data, you will find that Saudi Arabia has already started to make defense deals with China and Russia. One more reason is that oil consumption of these BRICS nations, which are China, Brazil and India, are the most. These three countries are the biggest consumers of oil in the world. So, if Saudi Arabia will join BRICS, then they will get the biggest oil buyers in the world. This brings us the most important question of all, and that is, what will happen if Saudi Arabia joins BRICS? Well, the first thing that is going to happen is that the US economy will ruin the US banks because interest rate will spike and it will lead to a disaster. Now, one more question arises, how will it even possible? So, the simple answer lies in the petrodollar recycling. Since majority of oil can be bought only in dollars, all the countries keep their dollar reserves with the US banks, and because they are anyways using the dollar to trade oil, they use the surplus dollars for other trade purposes, or they invested in the US economy. For example, in the case of India, although India did only $175 billion worth of trade with US this year, and we still have $532.868 billion in our reserves. So, from the rest $357 billion, $200 billion may be used to trade with other countries, and the rest $157 billion could invest into the US economy in the form of US Treasury bonds. And just like that, all the countries in the world have their surplus foreign reserves invested in the US economy. This money in total amounts to $7.5 trillion, and this money is used by the US banks for lending to American businesses at a very low interest rates. As a result, the debt is very cheap in the US. So, eventually American businesses prosper and their economy keeps on growing. Therefore, if Saudi Arabia will join BRICS, then they could have to sign something called the bilateral currency swap agreement, by which the BRICS countries will not have to buy oils in dollars. If you don't know what is bilateral currency swap agreement, then here is the simple explanation. Let's say China and UK sign a bilateral currency swap agreement of 5 years for a value of $1 million. It means China will sell $1 million worth of yuan to UK, and UK will sell $1 million worth of pounds to China. So, after conversion, China will give 6.842 million yuan to UK, and UK will give 8,47,250 pounds to China. Suppose they would agree upon the exchange rate to be 8.07. So, for 5 years, Chinese central bank can sell these pounds and get US dollars, or it can lend these pounds to domestic banks and companies to settle their trade. Similarly, the Bank of England can do the same with yuan. So, now if an English businessman wants to buy goods worth of 1 million yuan from China, then the English businessman would simply borrow 1 million yuan from the Bank of England and directly pay the Chinese bank account in England. As soon as this money is transferred in the Chinese bank account in England, the Chinese bank in China would transfer 1 million yuan to the Chinese businessman. And the same thing could be done vice versa. If you look closely, then two big players can do international trade without depending on the dollar. And this is how bilateral currency swap works. After 5 years, both central banks of UK and China will pay their respective currencies back at the agreed exchange rate of 8.07. So this way, both the countries get three major advantages. Number 1, both countries can eliminate their exchange rate risk. Number 2, both countries can use this currency to exchange it for dollar if needed. And number 3, businesses in both countries can carry out trade more economically. And last, the dependency on the US dollar decreased by a large extent. So, if Saudi Arabia will join BRICS and sign these agreements, India and China will no longer be using dollars to trade for oils. And as we have discussed, they are two of the biggest consumers of oil. This is a huge setback for the US because China alone holds $1 trillion worth of US bonds. So, if they are not buying oil in dollars, then China could sell those bonds and that could put a dent on the American economy. After all these, now we have the most important topic, and that is BRICS currency. According to Putin's announcement, this new currency would act like a basket containing the value of 5 BRICS countries, which are the Chinese renminbi, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, the Brazilian real, and the South African rand. This basket would make it semi-decentralized and more stable than the US dollar. This currency could be gold-backed. In simple words, the value of a gold-backed currency is backed to gold. So, if Indian rupee becomes gold-backed, then the value of rupee will be defined such that 1 gram of gold equal to rupees 50,000. It means that if you give rupees 50,000 to RBI, then they would redeem its value by giving you 1 gram of gold. But with flat currency, it is not backed by any commodity. Flat currency is nothing but the ordinary currency that we are using daily. It's a common currency issued by the government like our Indian rupee. Absolutely, this new BRICS currency will be a game changer. So, now let's understand it. So in the case of gold-backed currency, if the government has 1 kg of gold and 1 gram of gold is worth rupees 50,000, then the government can only print rupees 50,000 into 1,000, which is rupees 50 million of currency bills. If they want to print more, then they will have to first buy more gold and keep it in the reserves. But with flat currency, they can simply go on to print money, and this causes inflation in the economy. This is the reason why the BRICS nations have been buying gold at insane levels. This brings me to the conclusion part of this video. If the BRICS succeed in designing their own currency, we could again have a currency backed by gold. It will become the most valuable currency on earth. And more importantly, if Saudi Arabia will join BRICS, then it will not just be gold. Even oil will lay the foundations for BRICS currency. So, two of the most valuable commodities on the planet will back both this alliance. If things would go well, then the next superpower will be the BRICS nation. Thank you so much everyone for giving us your valuable time and watching our video till the end.